The gun was already pressed against Nelson Boone's temple when Harriet Ramsey realized she had been the one who led them straight to him. She stood in the doorway of the Dusty Creek saloon, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts, the August heat of 1882 pressing down on her like a physical weight. The man holding the gun was Croft Dellard, and his smile was the kind that belonged on a rattlesnake. 3 of his men flanked him, their hands loose and ready at their sides. Nelson sat in the chair before her, blood already darkening his shirt at the collar, his dark eyes fixed not on the gun but on her face. He was reading her, even now. Even with a barrel at his skull, he was trying to understand what she was feeling. That was the thing about Nelson Boone that had undone her from the very beginning. "Well now," Dellard said, his voice a slow and satisfied drawl. "This is a prettier outcome than I hoped for. I get Boone and I get the woman who helped me find him. 2 birds." "I didn't help you," Harriet said, and the words came out harder than she intended, harder than she felt. "You rode straight here from Widow Calloway's farm," Dellard said. "My man was watching the whole road. You led us right to him, Miss Ramsey. Whether you meant to or not, he tilted his head. Though I wonder very much." And there it was, the trap she had not seen, the hidden motive she had not understood, the betrayal she had not committed in her heart but that looked from the outside exactly like one. Nelson's jaw was tight. He had not spoken a word. He was staring at her still, and she wanted to scream at him, wanted to explain, wanted to cross the room and take his hands and make him understand that she had not known, she had never known, that Dellard had someone watching her. But the words were lodged in her chest like splinters, and Dellard's men were moving closer, and the whole moment was balanced on the edge of a knife. It had not always been like this between them. It had not always been guns and blood and forced choices. 6 weeks ago, Harriet Ramsey had not even known that Nelson Boone existed. She had arrived in Dusty Creek, Texas on a Thursday in late June, on the afternoon stage from San Antonio. She was 26 years old, sharp-faced and sharp-minded, with a degree of stubbornness that her late mother had called a gift and her father had called a catastrophe. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned severely and green eyes that people tended to underestimate, which was a mistake they usually made only once. She had a carpetbag, a trunk, $40, and a letter of employment from a man named Mr. Theodore Wycombe, who ran the only schoolhouse in Dusty Creek and who had written that he required a teacher of good moral character and strong discipline, and that the salary was modest but the community was welcoming. The community, as it turned out, was a complicated thing. Dusty Creek was not large. It sat in a shallow basin between 2 ridges, with a main street that ran roughly east to west and a creek that was neither dusty nor particularly impressive, though it did run year-round, which counted for something in that part of Texas. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, a post office, the saloon, 2 boarding houses, and a collection of farms and ranches that spread out into the surrounding country. The population was somewhere around 200 souls, which included the ranching families, the Mexican families who had been there long before any Anglo settler, and a handful of people whose pasts were better left unexamined. Harriet had come because she needed work, and because San Antonio had become impossible after her father died and left nothing but debt, and because a frontier school was still a school, and she had always believed that education was the most important thing a person could do with their time on earth. She had not come looking for anyone. She had been very clear with herself about that. The boarding house where she took a room was run by a woman named Mrs. Agnes Polk, who was 60, broad and relentlessly cheerful, and who had an opinion about everything and everyone in Dusty Creek, which she shared freely and without being asked. "You'll want to know about the troublesome elements," Agnes said on Harriet's first evening, setting a bowl of stew in front of her with a decisive thunk. "Every town has them. Ours has Croft Dellard." "Who is Croft Dellard?" Harriet asked. Agnes made a sound of deep contempt. "Man who thinks he owns this valley. runs cattle officially, runs everything else unofficially, got fingers in the land deals, in the water rights, in the county commission. If something crooked is happening in Dusty Creek, it's happening because Dellard wants it to, or because Dellard is profiting from it. Is there a sheriff? We have a sheriff, Agnes said. His name is Earl Cobb, and he is about as much use as a screen door on a submarine, if you'll pardon the expression. Dellard owns him same as he owns the rest. She sat down across from Harriet and folded her thick arms. But there is one man Dellard hasn't been able to own, one man who keeps causing him problems. His name is Nelson Boone. Harriet had not been particularly interested at that moment. She had been tired from the journey, and she was thinking about her classroom and her supplies and how many students she might have. But she filed the name away, the way she filed everything, neatly and precisely. She met Nelson Boone 3 days later, though she did not know it was him at first. It was Sunday morning, and she was walking to the church, taking the longer route because she wanted to see more of the town before the service. She had turned down a side street between the general store and the livery stable when she heard raised voices, and then what sounded distinctly like a fist connecting with a jaw. She stopped, which was the sensible thing to do. Then she went forward to look, which was the Harriet Ramsey thing to do. There were 4 men in the narrow alley. 3 of them were large and rough-looking, and the 4th was on the ground, pushing himself up with one hand, blood on his mouth, a look on his face that was more furious than afraid. He was tall, that much she could see. Dark hair, several days of beard, a worn canvas jacket. His hat was in the dirt 3 feet away. "Stay down," one of the large men said. "That's going to be your advice." The man on the ground said, and his voice was steady and dry, which struck Harriet as remarkable given the circumstances. "Stay down. That's the best you've got." He got up. It did not go well for him immediately. One of the 3 men hit him again, and he went sideways into the livery wall, and Harriet's mouth opened before she had made any decision whatsoever. "Stop that," she said. All 4 men turned to look at her. The 3 large ones looked annoyed. The man against the wall looked startled, which was the first expression she'd seen on him that wasn't either dry or furious, and she filed that away too. "Ma'am," one of the large men said with elaborate patience, "this is none of your concern." 3 against 1 looks like everyone's concern, Harriet said. She was aware, distantly, that this was not a safe thing to be doing. She did it anyway. If there's a legitimate dispute here, it can be settled in front of Sheriff Cobb. The mention of the sheriff did something interesting. The 3 men exchanged glances, and she watched the calculation happen behind their eyes, and then, without another word, they left. They walked past her close enough that she could smell the sweat and tobacco on them, and they did not look at her again. The man against the wall looked at her for a long moment. He picked up his hat. He touched 2 fingers to his bleeding mouth and looked at the blood and then at her. "Thank you," he said. It came out reluctant, like it cost him something to say it. "You're welcome," Harriet said. "Are you badly hurt?" "No." A pause. "Are you new here?" "I arrived Thursday. I'm the new schoolteacher." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, not exactly. More like the shadow of one moving across dark water. "That explains it," he said. "Explains what?" "Why you're not afraid of them," he said. "You don't know yet who they work for." She would learn that and so much else in the weeks that followed. His name, as it turned out, was Nelson Boone. He was 31 years old, though he looked older when he was tired and younger when he forgot to guard his expression. He had come to Dusty Creek 2 years prior, after a long and complicated time in his life that he did not volunteer details about. He had a small farm at the edge of the valley, near the creek, and he kept horses there, which he bred and sold, and he had a reputation in town that was layered and contradictory. People said he was trouble. People also said he was the only man who had stood up to Dellard's land grab the previous year, when Dellard's men had tried to fence off the creek access that 6 families depended on. Nelson had ridden to the county seat personally and filed a complaint that had actually held, which was more than anyone else had managed. Harriet learned most of this from Agnes, who was an inexhaustible source of local history, and some of it from other people in town, and a little of it, slowly and carefully, from Nelson himself. They did not become friends immediately. He was not a man who made friends easily or carelessly, and she had a quality that some people found off-putting, which was that she asked direct questions and expected direct answers. With most people in Dusty Creek, this caused a certain amount of social friction. With Nelson, it turned out to be exactly the right approach. The second time they properly talked was at the general store, 2 weeks into her time in Dusty Creek. She was trying to purchase chalk and a particular kind of writing paper, and the store owner, a fussy man named Mr. Griggs, was explaining that he could not order more supplies without a purchase order from Mr. Wycombe, and that Mr. Wycombe had not been in to sign the necessary forms, and that therefore the school supply situation was, regrettably, at an impasse. Harriet was working through the logic of this, which seemed circular and deliberate rather than genuinely procedural, when Nelson came through the door, and Griggs immediately straightened up and became 3 times more cooperative. "Miss Ramsey," Nelson said, touching his hat. He had clearly heard the tail end of the conversation. He looked at Griggs. "The lady needs chalk and paper. I was explaining to her that the procedure requires. The school is a community institution," Nelson said in a quiet voice that somehow carried enormous weight. "Order the supplies and bill the county. You know how this works." Griggs ordered the supplies. Outside, Harriet fell into step beside Nelson, which she suspected was not something many people did without being invited. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "But you did it anyway." "Chalk is important," he said. "Children can't learn without it." She stopped walking. He took 2 more steps before he seemed to notice and turned to look at her. "What?" He said. "You care about the school," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read. "I never had much schooling," he said finally. "Stopped when I was 11. My father needed me working." A pause. "I know what it costs not having it." That was the moment, though she would not have been able to say why, that Harriet Ramsey began to look at Nelson Boone differently. It was not a swift thing, what developed between them. It was careful and sometimes halting, built in moments rather than in declarations. He had a habit of appearing in her vicinity at times when something needed doing that he hadn't explicitly been asked to help with. When the school roof began to leak in a July rainstorm, she came in the following morning to find it patched. She didn't ask. She knew. When 3 of Dellard's ranch hands rode their horses through the schoolyard during a lesson and frightened the children, Nelson appeared at Dellard's office that same afternoon, and it did not happen again. She asked him about that directly, meeting him on the main street 3 days later. "What did you say to him?" she asked. Nelson's expression did something complicated. "I said that the schoolteacher was a respected member of this community, and that anyone who harassed her or her students would answer to me personally." "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said, for the second time, with the same tone as the first, and she realized that this was his answer to that particular protest. That he knew he didn't have to. That he was doing it because he chose to, and the choice was its own explanation. She began to understand that Nelson Boone had a dark past that he carried quietly, without dramatizing it, and that it had shaped him in ways that were sometimes visible and sometimes not. She learned that he had worked for a man similar to Dellard when he was young, in a different part of Texas, and that he had gotten out but not cleanly, and that there were things in that story that he held close and did not offer freely. She also learned that he was, beneath the guardedness and the hard exterior, a man who noticed things. Who noticed when the Mexican families along the creek were being short-changed at the market, and who said so plainly. Who noticed that old Tomas Vega's fence had collapsed in the summer heat, and who spent a Saturday fixing it without being asked. Who read, which surprised her and should not have, books borrowed from the small collection at the post office, and sometimes from her own classroom shelf, which he would ask for with a formality that she found endearing. He came to borrow a book on a Tuesday evening in late July, 3 weeks after her arrival, and she made him coffee, and they sat on the boarding house porch as the sun went down and talked about the book, which was a collection of essays on natural history, and then about other things, and the conversation went on well past dark until Agnes stuck her head out the door and said that it was 9 o'clock, and she wasn't running a hotel for social occasions. Nelson walked home in the dark, and Harriet sat in her room and looked at the ceiling and told herself very firmly that she was not developing feelings for this particular man, because he was complicated and closed off and lived in a place she had come to purely for work, and because she had spent the past 3 years of her life making practical decisions, and she was not going to stop now. She was not very convincing, even to herself. August arrived with heat so intense it felt personal, like the sun had a grudge. The school year had begun, and Harriet had 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she threw herself into the work with the thoroughness that characterized everything she did. But Nelson was in her thoughts in the in-between moments, and she was increasingly aware that she was looking for him when she was in town, and that when she found him, the particular quality of the day improved in a way she could not entirely attribute to reason. He began to meet her at the school in the late afternoons, not every day, but often enough that it became a pattern. He would arrive after the students had gone and sit on the top step outside while she straightened the room inside, and they would talk through the open doorway. Or sometimes he would come in and sit in one of the adult-sized chairs she had positioned near her desk, and they would talk face to face with the last of the afternoon light coming through the windows, and she was acutely, inconveniently aware of the way he looked at her during these conversations, direct and steady, like she was the most interesting landscape he had ever seen. One afternoon he arrived to find her struggling with the cast iron stove, which was refusing to draw properly and filling the room with smoke. He spent 30 minutes lying on the floor figuring out the problem, which turned out to be a damaged flue tile, and then fixing it with materials from his saddlebag, because he was the kind of man who kept materials in his saddlebag for exactly such eventualities. When he stood up, his face was smudged with soot and his shirt was dusty, and he was close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes, which were dark brown with a warmth in them that he usually kept better hidden. She was holding a cloth, meaning to offer it to him so he could clean his face, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Nelson," she said, and her voice came out softer than she had intended. "Harriet," he said, equally soft, equally off guard. Then Agnes's voice carried around the side of the building, calling about supper, and they both stepped back, and the moment dissolved, and they walked back to the boarding house 3 feet apart and talked about nothing consequential. But the air between them had changed, and they both knew it. It was Croft Dellard who forced the issue, as Croft Dellard forced most things in Dusty Creek. Dellard had been acquiring land in the valley for 5 years, through means that were sometimes legal and sometimes not. He wanted the water rights to the full length of Dusty Creek, and he wanted the acreage on the eastern ridge, and he wanted to be the unchallenged power in the county by the time the railroad came through, which everyone said would happen within the next 2 years. Nelson's farm sat on a critical piece of that eastern access, and Nelson had refused twice to sell at any price. In early August, the threats began to be more direct. 2 of Nelson's horses were let loose in the night. A fence was cut. A note was left on his door with language that was not ambiguous. Nelson told Harriet about these things steadily and without dramatics, and she listened and felt something cold and hard settle in her chest, which she recognized as fear for him, which told her something about herself that she had to stop pretending not to know. "You should go to the county sheriff," she said. "Not the local Sheriff Cobb, who was useless, but the county authority." "I've written to the county," he said, "twice. The county moves slowly." "Then let me help," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between touched and pained. "Harriet, these are dangerous men. I'm aware of that. I'm not proposing to challenge them to a duel. I'm proposing to use the tools available to me, which include the ability to write an extremely persuasive letter, a relationship with the schoolchildren's parents, most of whom have grievances against Dellard of their own, and a considerable amount of stubbornness. He almost smiled. It happened more often now, the almost smiles, the moments where his guard came down just enough to show the warmth underneath. "You are the most unusual woman I have ever met," he said. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is one," he said, and the way he said it made her breath catch. They worked together on a petition to the county commissioner, gathering signatures from families across the valley, documenting instances of intimidation and illegal land maneuvering. It was during these evenings, riding together to outlying farms, that the space between them finally collapsed. It happened on the road back from Widow Calloway's farm, which was 5 miles east of town, on a Wednesday evening when the sky had turned extraordinary shades of rose and copper. The Widow Calloway had been one of the most important signatures, because she had documentation of Dellard's men trespassing and destroying her fence line. They had what they needed, and they were riding back in the good satisfaction of it, and Nelson had been telling her something about the eastern ridge in the early mornings, how the light hit it and how it was the only thing about this particular corner of Texas that he thought was genuinely beautiful. "You've been here 2 years, Harriet said. Surely you could find beauty in more than one thing." He looked at her, and there was nothing guarded about it at all. "I can," he said quietly. The horses walked on. The sky deepened. And then at the bottom of a shallow draw where the creek bent and the cottonwoods made a canopy, Nelson drew his horse to a stop, and she stopped hers beside him, and he turned to her, and she turned to him, and there was a long moment where the whole world seemed to hold very still. "Harriet," he said, "I need to say something to you." "Then say it," she said, and her heart was hammering, and she kept her voice even with an effort. "I don't have a simple life," he said. "I have a complicated past and a present situation that is genuinely dangerous, and I don't have very many things to offer. But I have—" He stopped, looked down at his horse's mane for a moment, then looked back at her, and it was the most honest expression she had ever seen on a human face. "I have thought about you every day since Sunday morning in that alley," he said. "I think you are the most remarkable person I have met in a very long time, and I think that if you were willing I would like very much to court you properly, if that's something you'd consider." "Nelson Boone," Harriet said, "I have thought about you every day since that same Sunday morning, and I am absolutely considering it." Yes. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and held it, and they sat like that in the fading light under the cottonwoods with the creek running quietly nearby, and it was the most significant moment of Harriet Ramsey's life to that point, and she knew it clearly and without confusion, which was unusual for a person who generally required more time to be certain of things. They rode back to town with their hands occasionally touching when the path was wide enough. They did not make declarations or promises. They did not need to yet. But something had settled into place, solid and real, and when he helped her down from her horse in front of the boarding house and held her hand a moment longer than was strictly necessary, she felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the lingering August heat. That had been 3 days ago. And now she was standing in the doorway of the saloon, and Croft Dellard had a gun against Nelson's temple, and the worst part was not the gun. The worst part was the look on Nelson's face, which was not fear but was something that might, if she was reading it correctly, be the beginning of betrayal, and she could not bear it. "I didn't lead them to you," she said directly to Nelson, and she put everything she had into it, all the directness and all the earnestness that was her truest nature. "I didn't know they were watching. I came because I had the Widow Calloway's signature and I wanted you to have it. I didn't know." Nelson held her gaze for a long moment. Then very slightly the tension in his jaw eased. "I know," he said, quiet and certain. Dellard made a sound of dismissal, very touching. "Now here is what is going to happen. Boone, you are going to sign over the deed to your land. Tonight I have a lawyer waiting. The lady here is going to witness it, and then both of you are going to get on horses and ride in opposite directions and be grateful that I'm in a generous mood. And if I don't sign," Nelson said. Dellard pressed the gun harder. "Then we discuss the alternative, which is considerably less pleasant for everyone involved." Harriet was thinking rapidly. The saloon was not empty. There were perhaps 12 other people in it, most of them keeping their eyes firmly on their drinks or the floor, the particular posture of men who have decided that whatever is happening is not their problem. But she noticed things. The bartender, a compact man named Sewell, who had signed their petition. 2 farmers near the back wall, both of whom had also signed. And the fact that Dellard's 3 men were arranged in a triangle, and that the triangle had a gap in it near the left side that was perhaps the width of 2 people. She also noticed that one of Dellard's men had his holster strap unfastened, because he'd been in the saloon a while, because Dellard had not expected to find Nelson here tonight, and the ambush had been hastily arranged. "Mr. Dellard," she said, raising her voice, not to him alone but to the room, "I want everyone here to note that what you are doing tonight constitutes extortion and armed robbery, and that there are witnesses." "Witnesses who value their health will keep their mouths shut," Dellard said. "That may be so," Harriet said. "But I also want you to know that everything we have documented about your land practices, your intimidation tactics, and your illegal use of Sheriff Cobb's office has been prepared in 2 complete copies, one of which was mailed to the county commissioner 3 days ago, and one of which is currently in the possession of a lawyer in San Antonio who has been retained for exactly this purpose." She paused. "Shooting Nelson Boone tonight will not make those documents disappear. It will only add murder to the list of your crimes." There was silence. This was, in point of fact, not entirely true. They had prepared documents, yes. They had been in the process of arranging legal representation, but they had not yet mailed anything to the county commissioner, and there was no San Antonio lawyer. Not yet. She was, to put it plainly, bluffing with a confidence she did not feel, but Croft Dellard did not know that. She watched the calculation move through his face. She watched him weigh it. The killing of one difficult man against the risk that the paperwork already existed, that the story was already moving, that killing Nelson tonight might bring more scrutiny rather than less. She watched greed and caution compete, and she held her breath and kept her expression completely steady, and thought, very deliberately, about her 14 students, and about the families who had signed that petition, and about Nelson's hand holding hers in the fading light by the cottonwoods. "This isn't over," Dellard said. He lowered the gun. He stepped back and his men fell in behind him, and they left through the saloon's back door, and the room exhaled as one. Harriet crossed the room in 4 steps and was at Nelson's side before she had formed a conscious intention to do so. Up close, the cut on his head was worse than it had looked from the doorway. She put her hand against his face without thinking about it, tipping his head to the side to see. "You're bleeding," she said. "I'm fine," he said, which was demonstrably not entirely true, but she recognized that it was not a complaint, it was a statement of intention. He was looking at her with an expression that was absolutely unguarded, and she realized her hand was still on his face and she didn't move it. "Was any of that true?" he said. "The lawyer, the commissioner." "Parts of it," she said. "We're going to make all of it true starting tomorrow morning." He put his hand over hers where it rested on his face, warm and steady and certain. "Harriet," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'd like to get out of this saloon," he said, "and I'd like to sit somewhere quiet and I'd like to talk to you, if that's all right." "That," she said, "is more than all right." They sat on the church steps, because the church was empty at that hour and the steps faced west and the night air had finally lost some of the day's fierceness. Nelson had a cloth pressed to the cut on his head, and Harriet sat beside him close enough that their shoulders touched, and he told her what had happened, how he had come to the saloon to meet a man named Garfield, who sometimes passed information about Dellard's operations, and how instead of Garfield he had found Dellard's men waiting. "Garfield must have been persuaded to change sides," Nelson said, "or threatened into it." "Or paid," Harriet said. "Or paid," he agreed. "It doesn't change what we do next," she said. "We finish the documentation. We get it into the right hands. We stop letting Dellard run this valley by keeping everyone too afraid to act." He looked at her sideways in the dark with that particular expression she was starting to know well, the one that he hadn't had a name for when she first met him, because he hadn't had much occasion to feel it before she arrived. "You are extraordinary," he said. "You said unusual before," she said. "Both," he said. "Both are true." She was very aware of his shoulder against hers, and the warmth of him in the night air, and the fact that an hour ago she had been terrified for him in a way that told her everything she needed to know about what she felt. "Nelson," she said, "when I saw Dellard's gun against your head, she stopped, took a breath. I was very afraid." "I know," he said. "I saw your face. And then I thought I might have led them there, and that was another breath. That was worse. The idea that I could be the cause of something happening to you." "You were not the cause," he said firmly. "You came to me. That's not the same thing. Dellard's choices are Dellard's, not yours." He turned toward her slightly, and his voice dropped, became quieter and more careful. "And I meant what I said in there. I know you. The simplicity of that. I know you." Harriet felt it settle in her chest like something that had been waiting to land. Two words that were, from Nelson Boone, more significant than most speeches. "I know you too," she said. He took her hand, and they sat in the quiet for a long time, and the stars above Dusty Creek were tremendous, the way they always were in that part of Texas, and nothing was resolved yet, and they both knew it, but they were sitting together in the dark with their hands entwined, and it was enough for that night. The next 2 weeks were the most intense and focused of Harriet's professional life. She wrote letters with a clarity and force she hadn't known she possessed, laying out the documented case against Croft Dellard in the kind of language that could not be dismissed or ignored. Nelson contributed his own records, meticulous notes he had been keeping for 2 years about every incident of intimidation, every suspicious transaction, every fence line that had been mysteriously moved. Widow Calloway rode into town personally to add her testimony, and 3 of the Mexican farming families along the creek, who had been the quietest because they had the most to lose, came forward with evidence of Dellard having their water access deliberately sabotaged. They worked on this together in the evenings at the school or at Agnes's dining table, with coffee and lamplight and the occasional disagreement about strategy, because they were 2 people with strong opinions, and they did not always agree, which turned out to be one of the things Harriet liked most about their interactions. Nelson pushed back when he thought she was wrong. She pushed back when she thought he was wrong. Neither of them capitulated out of politeness, and neither of them held grudges when they were overruled, and the whole thing had an aliveness to it that felt, to Harriet, like what she had always wanted and had not found in San Antonio or anywhere else she had lived. They also, in those 2 weeks, kissed for the first time, which happened on a Thursday evening on the school steps. She had been showing him the letter she'd drafted to the county commissioner, and he had been reading it with his head bent close to hers over the page, and she had made a small correction in the margin, and he had laughed, which was a rare and wonderful thing. Nelson's laugh, genuine and warm and not given out carelessly, and she had turned to look at his face when he was laughing, and he had turned at the same moment to look at hers, and they were very close, and then they were closer. It was brief and gentle, the first one, but it was not uncertain. Neither of them was uncertain about it for even a moment, and when they drew back and looked at each other, she was smiling, and he was doing the thing that was almost a smile but better, and he said very quietly, "I've been wanting to do that since the alley." "Since the alley," she said. "That was our first meeting." "I know," he said, which was the 3rd time he had said those 2 words as his complete answer to something, and this time she laughed and he did too, and it was very good. The county commissioner responded faster than either of them had dared to hope. The letter arrived in the 2nd week of August, formal and headed with the county seal, acknowledging receipt of their documentation, and informing them that an inquiry had been opened. 3 days later, a man named Federal Deputy Joshua Stern arrived in Dusty Creek on the morning stage, which turned out to be partly a result of the petition, and partly because Dellard had enemies in places that Harriet and Nelson hadn't even been aware of, men he'd wronged in previous counties who had their own complaints waiting. Sheriff Cobb, upon the deputy's arrival, developed a sudden and convenient illness that kept him confined to his home for the better part of a week. Croft Dellard retained 2 lawyers, but the documentation was substantial, and the deputy was not a man to be impressed by legal maneuvering. Dellard's operation began to unravel slowly, but with the particular inevitability of things that have been built on rotten foundations. Nelson was called to give testimony, which he did with the same quiet precision he brought to everything, and Harriet sat beside him through it, and she was aware of a profound pride that she did not try to disguise. Dellard was not arrested immediately, which was frustrating, but the federal process was moving, and the deputy was thorough, and in the interim, Dellard's men largely stopped their activities in the valley because the legal risk had become too visible. The immediate danger, the kind that had meant a gun against Nelson's head, receded. With the pressure eased, there was room to breathe, and in the breathing, other things came forward. They rode together in the morning sometimes, before the school day began, which was Nelson's suggestion, offered with the careful tentativeness of a man who was not accustomed to wanting things and was not entirely sure how to ask for them. She said yes immediately, and his relief was visible and endearing. They rode to the eastern ridge and looked out over the valley in the early morning light, which was as beautiful as he had said it was, the creek catching the sun like a ribbon of copper far below and the sky enormous and clear. On one of these mornings she asked him about his past, the dark part of it, the thing he carried quietly. She did not press or demand. She simply said, "Tell me if you want to, and let the space hold open." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the valley. Then he said, "I told you I worked for a man like Dellard when I was young. His name was Graves, and he ran cattle in the hill country, and he was as corrupt as they come. I knew what he was, and I stayed because I needed the work and because I was young, and I told myself that what he did wasn't my responsibility as long as I wasn't the one doing it." He paused. "That's a lie young men tell themselves. Eventually you have to choose. I chose late. By the time I left, I had been part of things I'm not proud of. Nothing that took a life, but things that hurt people. Mexican families who lost land. A man who went to prison on evidence that was partly manufactured by Graves and partly enabled by people like me who stayed quiet." He looked at her then. "I've spent the last several years trying to decide what that means about who I am, whether a person can change the direction of a thing by doing better, even after having done poorly." "I think they can," Harriet said without hesitation. "I think that's precisely what you've been doing." He looked at her steadily. "It matters that you think so," he said. "It matters more than I expected." "It matters to me that you told me," she said. He nodded, looked back at the valley. "I don't have secrets from you," he said. "I realized that some time ago. The idea of having secrets from you feels wrong, uncomfortable, like wearing a coat that doesn't fit." She laughed softly. "That is a very specific comparison." "I'm a specific person," he said, with the smallest possible smile, the real one, and she wanted very much to reach across and put her hand on his face again, so she did, and he turned into it briefly, like a man who had not been touched gently very often and was still slightly surprised when it happened. The legal proceedings against Dellard took the rest of that summer and stretched into autumn. Nelson's land was never successfully seized. The petition held. The county inquiry became a full federal investigation when it became clear the corruption extended to 2 elected officials, and Croft Dellard, by October, was facing charges that would occupy the courts for the better part of a year. Sheriff Cobb quietly resigned and left town in September, which everyone agreed was the best outcome for everyone. A new sheriff was elected in November, a straightforward man named Alderman Hayes, who had no particular debt to anyone, and who turned out to be exactly what a town like Dusty Creek needed. In September, between the legal proceedings and the start of the school's 2nd month, Nelson asked Harriet to come to his farm. He had mentioned it, but she had not been there yet, and she understood that the invitation meant something, that it was a showing of something he valued and a trust being extended. The farm was modest, which she had expected, but it was also clearly cared for, which she had also expected but was glad to see confirmed. The house was a simple two-room structure, solid and well-maintained. The paddock held 5 horses, including a young mare that he had been working with since spring, and she watched him with the mare and felt something warm and steady in her chest that she recognized as a particular kind of joy. The joy of seeing someone fully themselves, without performance or audience. He had planted a kitchen garden along the south side of the house which had produced well through the summer. He showed her the creek where it ran through the lower edge of his property, clear and quick over smooth stones with pecan trees along the bank. "This is why he wants it," Harriet said. "The water access, the trees, it's valuable." "Yes," Nelson said, "and he won't have it. Simple and certain." She looked at him standing by the creek in the autumn light, and she thought about something that she had been thinking about for several weeks with increasing clarity. She thought about the $40 she'd arrived with and the modest schoolteacher's salary and the boarding house that was comfortable but not hers. She thought about the 14 students she was teaching and the second year she was already planning, the expanded curriculum she wanted to introduce in the spring. She thought about what it felt like to be in Nelson Boone's company, which was different from any feeling she had identified before. It was ease, partly. But it was also a particular kind of alertness, a quality of being fully present and fully herself, not managing herself or moderating or calculating, just existing in a space where she was exactly who she was, and that was entirely acceptable, more than acceptable. She had known him for 2 months. She was aware that 2 months was not a long time. She was also aware, with the clarity that was her particular gift, that some knowledge does not require quantity of time, only quality of attention, and she had paid very close attention. "Nelson," she said. He turned from the creek. "Yes. I'm going to stay," she said. "In Dusty Creek. I want you to know that. I came for a 1-year contract, but I've already spoken with Mr. Wycombe about renewing, and I intend to. I'm not going anywhere." He was still. Very still in the way he went still when something had hit close to something real. "Because of the school," he said. "Partly," she said. "Partly because of the school." The moment stretched. A hawk circled somewhere above the pecan trees. The creek ran. He crossed the space between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back or change her expression. And she did neither, and he stopped very close to her and looked at her face with that absolute, unguarded directness. "I would like you to stay," he said, with a careful precision that meant he was choosing every word, "for reasons that are entirely and specifically personal." "Then we are in agreement," she said, and she was smiling, and he put his hands on her face the way she had put her hand on his, gentle and wondering, and kissed her there by the creek in the autumn light. And it was nothing like the first kiss, which had been brief and tentative, because this one was long and certain, and full of everything that 2 careful people hold back until they are sure enough to let it through. October settled over the valley like a blessing, golden and warm, and the legal machinery churned forward, and the school had 18 students now because word had spread that Miss Ramsey's teaching was worth crossing a few extra miles for, and Harriet felt, for the first time in many years, that she was precisely where she ought to be. She and Nelson were together openly, which caused some comment in Dusty Creek, because small towns in 1882 had opinions about unmarried people keeping company. But the comment was largely approving rather than otherwise, because Harriet was respected for what she had done regarding Dellard, and Nelson was respected in the complicated way he had always been, and the two of them together seemed, to most people in town, like a thing that made a certain obvious sense. Agnes Polk, who had watched the whole thing unfold from the very beginning with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had seen what was coming before either of them had, said to Harriet one evening with an air of complete self-congratulation, "I told you he was the most interesting person in this town." "You told me he was a troublesome element," Harriet said. "Both things can be true," Agnes said, and went back to her knitting. On a Saturday in late October, Nelson came to the boarding house in the morning with an air of careful purpose that she recognized. She had come to know his moods with the intimacy of close attention, and this particular mood was the one he had when he was about to say something important and was slightly afraid of the response. "Walk with me," he said. They walked to the edge of town and along the creek path, the cottonwoods now yellow-leafed and brilliant, the air cool and carrying the smell of autumn grass. He was quiet for a while, which she allowed, because she had learned not to fill his silences with noise. "I have been thinking," he said, eventually. "I suspected as much," she said. He glanced at her with something that was definitely a smile now, not an almost anymore. The smiles had been coming more fully and more frequently, which she considered one of the finest achievements of her time in Dusty Creek. "I have been thinking," he said again, more deliberately, "about the future, specifically about my future, and about whether my future might be, whether you might be willing for it to include you in a more." He stopped, made a sound that was half frustration. "I'm not doing this well." "You're doing fine," she said. "I'm trying to ask you to marry me," he said, which came out very directly and without further ornament, which was entirely in keeping with who he was. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her and turned to face her, and she looked at his face, which was open and exposed and braced for the possibility of loss, and she thought about everything she knew of him, the dark past and the careful rebuilding, the quiet constancy, the way he said "I know you" with a simplicity that meant everything, the farm by the creek and the 14 students and the sky over Texas at dawn, and the feeling of being fully herself in his company. "Nelson Boone," she said. "Yes." The words seemed to land in him like water in dry ground. He exhaled. His hands came up and held both of hers, and he looked at her with an expression that had no guard in it anywhere, entirely open and entirely certain and entirely glad. "Yes," he said, as if he wanted to be sure. "Yes," she said, "absolutely and without hesitation. Yes." He pulled her close and she went, and they stood in the yellow cottonwood light with the creek running beside them, and it was, she thought, exactly right. Exactly, precisely right. They were married in November, on a Saturday when the sky was a deep clear blue, and the temperature was cool enough to be comfortable. The church was full, which surprised neither Agnes, who had organized the event with tremendous efficiency, nor Harriet, who had 20 students by then, and a relationship with nearly every family in the valley. Nelson stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that was clearly new and looked slightly unfamiliar on him, the way formal clothing always looks on a man more accustomed to canvas work jackets, and when Harriet walked down the aisle on the arm of old Tomás Vega, who had offered with a dignity that made her eyes sting, Nelson watched her come, and his face did the thing that she had learned to read as joy, contained but absolute, the kind that goes deep rather than wide. The minister was a kind and efficient man, and the ceremony was not overly long, and when Nelson said, "I will," it was with a steadiness that was entirely himself, and when she said it she was looking directly at him, which was also entirely herself. And when it was done, and he kissed her, the congregation made a warm and collective sound, and Agnes could be heard saying something approving. The reception was held at the church hall, with food contributed by what seemed like half the valley, and music provided by a Mexican family named the Herreras, who played with an energy and joy that got even the most solemn people on their feet. Harriet danced with several people, including young Tomás Vega the Jr., who was 8 and her best student, and Nelson danced with her twice, which she knew cost him something because he was self-conscious about dancing, and she loved him for it, loved him for doing the uncomfortable thing because he wanted to be in her company regardless. Deputy Joshua Stern, who was still in town working the Dellard case and had been an occasional presence at their table, offered his congratulations with genuine warmth. "A woman who can face down Croft Dellard with a bluff and a straight face is worth her weight in gold," he told Nelson, and Nelson said with absolute sincerity, "I know that." They spent their first night as a married couple at the farm, which smelled of wood smoke, and the dried herbs Harriet had hung in the kitchen when Nelson invited her to treat the space as her own, which was months ago now, but which still felt like a significant gesture every time she thought of it. It was cold enough that night to want the fire, and the fire was warm, and everything about it was as good as anything Harriet Ramsey had hoped for in her most honest and private imaginings. The winter of 1882 going into 1883 was cold but not brutal, and the farm was snug, and Harriet continued to teach, riding into town on weekday mornings on a small and reliable horse that Nelson had chosen for her with the quiet precision he brought to matters of her comfort and safety. He usually rode with her in the mornings, though he had his own work at the farm, and she understood that this was not protectiveness of the condescending kind, but rather something else entirely, a simple preference for her company that she more than shared. Dellard's case moved through the federal system with grinding slowness, as such things did in 1883, but it moved. By February, 3 of his primary associates had turned evidence against him in exchange for reduced charges, and the case against Dellard himself was increasingly solid. He was held, eventually, on charges of fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy, and the land he had illegally acquired was ordered returned to its original owners through a process that took until the following summer but that ultimately held. The valley, released from the pressure of Dellard's ambitions, began to breathe differently. The Mexican families along the creek expanded their operations. Widow Calloway, whose land had been under threat for years, was able to make improvements she'd been postponing. The new sheriff, Hayes, turned out to be genuinely good at his job, which was a thing people in Dusty Creek had almost forgotten was possible. Nelson's farm prospered in a modest way that suited them both. He was good with horses, genuinely and naturally so, and his reputation spread to surrounding counties, and by spring he was getting inquiries from buyers he'd never reached before. Harriet's school grew to 23 students, and she began working on a proposal for a second classroom and possibly a second teacher, which she presented to Mr. Wycombe with a thoroughness that left him no practical option but to agree. In March, Harriet discovered she was expecting a child. She told Nelson on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, because she was not a person for dramatic moments when a clear, direct statement would do. She told him and watched his face, and what she saw there was a rapid and complex sequence of emotions, surprise and wonder and a brief flash of something that looked like fear, which she understood, and then, rising through all of it, a warmth so complete and open that it was almost startling. He came around the table and took her hands and looked at her face and said very quietly, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I'm feeling excellent," she said. "I'm feeling entirely excellent." "A child," he said. "In September, I think," she said. He held her hands tightly and she could feel the emotion in the grip of his fingers, the way he sometimes expressed things physically because the words required more time than the feeling gave him. "Harriet," he said finally. He stopped. "Then I didn't know that I wanted this. I hadn't let myself think about it clearly, but now that you've said it I realize that I want it very much, that I am very glad." "So am I," she said simply. The spring and summer of 1883 were full. The school proposal was approved, and a second teacher arrived in April, a young woman named Miss Clara Forrest from Austin who turned out to be competent and agreeable, and who took to Dusty Creek with less culture shock than Harriet had managed. Harriet continued to teach through June, and planned to resume in September after the baby came, which the town doctor confirmed was a reasonable plan. Nelson, in those months, was a study in the particular attention of a man who has decided that something is the most important thing he has ever been involved with and is treating it accordingly. He built an addition onto the house, a third room properly finished, with a real wood floor, because the other 2 rooms were good but he wanted the child to have space. He consulted with the doctor repeatedly, more times than was strictly necessary, and Harriet found this endearing and told him so, which made him slightly embarrassed and not at all inclined to stop. Agnes Polk rode out to the farm at least once a week with food and opinions, and Harriet welcomed both. She was not a woman who found pregnancy mysterious or frightening, though she took it seriously, and she had a network of women in the valley who had been through it and who gave her practical information freely, because that was the thing about community, she had decided, the thing that made it different from mere proximity, the way knowledge moved person to person because people cared what happened to each other. The baby was born on a September morning, when the light was coming in long and gold through the new room's window. The doctor was there, and Agnes and Nelson, who held Harriet's hand through all of it with a steadiness that was entirely who he was, and when the child arrived into the world making his opinions about the transition abundantly clear, and when the doctor said it was a boy, Harriet looked at Nelson's face and saw something there that undid her completely, not in grief but in love, in the particular vertigo of watching a guarded person be entirely open. They named him James, which was both of their father's names, which was a coincidence that seemed significant. James Thomas Boone, and he had his mother's green eyes, which became clear within the first week, and Nelson looked at those eyes on a regular basis, with an expression that was as uncomplicated as anything Harriet had ever seen on him. She went back to teaching in October, with James in a carefully arranged corner of the classroom where she could see him, because there was no available arrangement for childcare, and because the parents of her students collectively decided that a schoolteacher's infant in the corner was not a disruption but a community responsibility, and several of the older girls took turns being extraordinarily helpful. Nelson thought this was slightly irregular, and then decided that Harriet's judgment on such things was generally reliable and let it go, which she appreciated. By the winter of 1883, the life they had built in Dusty Creek had a texture and fullness to it that Harriet sometimes thought about when she was sitting in the quiet before the house woke up, measuring it against what she had expected when she arrived on the afternoon stage with her carpetbag and her $40 and her determination. She had expected work and purpose, and she had those. She had not expected love of this particular quality, which was not dramatic in the daily sense, not full of grand gestures, but was instead consistently present, a current that ran through everything. Nelson was not demonstrative in public, which she had known from the beginning and had no complaints about, because in private he was a different thing entirely, a man who told her what he felt with a directness that matched her own, who came looking for her company in the evenings not from habit but from genuine want, who had a particular way of finding her in a room and standing close that she had come to depend on as much as she depended on anything. They had discussions, sometimes long ones, about things they disagreed on, about how to handle a difficult situation with one of her students whose home life was troubled, and what the appropriate intervention was, about whether to expand the horse breeding operation, which Nelson was cautious about and she thought was worth the risk, about the railroad, which was coming closer, and what it would mean for Dusty Creek, and whether the changes would be good or would bring new versions of the pressures they had already survived. These discussions were alive and genuine and sometimes heated, and she loved them, loved the quality of engagement, loved that he never retreated into silence to avoid friction, that he argued his position and listened to hers and changed his mind when she made a good case for it, because he was not a man whose ego required him to be right more than he required accurate understanding. In the spring of 1884, the railroad survey teams arrived, and it became clear that Dusty Creek was going to be on the new line, which changed everything and also changed nothing essential. The town would grow. New people would come. Prices would shift and business would change, and there would be new pressures and new opportunities. All of that was true. What was also true was that Nelson Boone's farm sat on a piece of land by a creek with pecan trees and a kitchen garden, and a house with 3 rooms and a vegetable plot that Harriet had expanded considerably, and that in the evenings when James was put to sleep, and the lamps were low. They sat together at the table or on the porch depending on the season and talked, or sometimes didn't talk, just sat in the company of each other, which was its own kind of conversation. Croft Dellard was convicted in the federal case in April of 1884, sentenced to 5 years and required to pay substantial restitution to the parties he had defrauded. The news came through on a Wednesday, and Nelson read the letter from Deputy Stern twice and then handed it to Harriet without comment. She read it and looked at him, and he was already looking at her. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She stood up and put her arms around him, and he held her tightly, and they stayed like that for a long time in the kitchen with James asleep in his room and the evening coming in through the windows. And it was not a celebration exactly, but it was a closing, a thread resolved, and the relief of it ran through both of them like the creek ran through the lower field, quiet and steady and right. In the summer of 1884, with the railroad coming and the town changing and James learning to walk with the tremendous seriousness of a child who has decided that locomotion is a matter of deep personal importance, Harriet discovered she was expecting again. She told Nelson in the same way she had the first time, at the kitchen table with coffee direct and clear, and his reaction was the same in its essential quality, that warmth and wonder and gladness, though quicker this time, less surprised, more immediately available. "February?" he asked. "February," she confirmed. He smiled. Not the almost smile, not the shadow of one. The full, real, warm smile that she had worked so hard for in the beginning, and that now appeared with a frequency that still made her unreasonably happy. "Good," he said. "James needs someone to boss around," she laughed. "He is bossy, isn't he?" "Takes after his mother," Nelson said, with a perfect straightness of face, and she threw a dishcloth at him, and he caught it, still smiling. The second child was born in February 1885, a girl they named Margaret, called Maggie almost immediately by everyone, who arrived into the world with considerably less drama than her brother, and who proceeded to have strong opinions about everything from her first days, which her father looked at with the specific expression of a man who recognizes a pattern. With 2 children and a growing farm and a school that now had 31 students and 2 teachers and a real second classroom, the life in Dusty Creek had a richness that was not about wealth but about depth. The railroad came through that spring, and the town did indeed change, growing in ways that were sometimes wonderful and sometimes difficult, and Harriet and Nelson navigated those changes the way they navigated everything, together and usually talking. There was a moment in May of that year, a Saturday morning, when she came out of the house to find Nelson in the paddock with James, who was 2½ and deeply committed to the project of getting close to the horses. Nelson was letting him stand near the young mare, the one he'd been working with back in the year before their marriage, now calm and steady and apparently willing to tolerate the presence of one very small and very determined boy. Harriet stood at the paddock fence and watched Nelson's hands, big and careful, guiding James, the child's face full of concentrated wonder and Nelson's face full of something so complete that she had to press her lips together. He looked up and saw her watching, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the paddock in the morning sun, and it was a moment like the many moments that made up their life, unremarkable in itself and irreplaceable in its fullness. He smiled at her. She smiled back. James said something emphatic and incomprehensible and patted the mare's nose, and the mare was patient, and Nelson kept his careful hands ready and his eyes warm, and the pecan trees along the creek were beginning to leaf out again for another spring. There had been a time when Harriet Ramsey arrived in a new town with a carpetbag and an address and $40 and a determination to be sufficient unto herself, and that woman was still in her, the stubbornness and the directness and the quality of paying attention that had always been her truest nature. She had not become someone different, but she had become more completely herself, which was a different thing, a better thing, The thing that happened when you found a place and a person that did not require you to diminish yourself to fit. Dusty Creek in the spring of 1885 was not the same town it had been when she arrived 3 years before. The railroad had brought prosperity and new families and new complications. The Dellard era was over, and in its place was something more ordinary and more sustainable, the kind of community that argues about fence lines and school funding and the price of goods at the market rather than about who controls the water and who is being driven out by force. It was not perfect. Communities were not perfect, but it was alive and real, and it was home. Her students grew and changed. Some of them would stay in the valley and some would leave, as young people did, chasing the things that the world beyond the creek and the ridge held out to them. She thought sometimes about what she was giving them, which was not just arithmetic and reading but a model, the example of someone who knew her own mind and used it, and refused to be made small by people with power over her. She hoped that was enough. She thought it probably was. She walked back into the house on that May morning and put Maggie in the high chair that Nelson had built through a series of evenings, consulting a pattern and adjusting when the first version was not quite right, which was very Nelson, the willingness to do something again until it was right. She put coffee on and stood at the kitchen window and watched the two of them in the paddock, the man and the small boy and the patient mare in the morning light. The forbidden had become familiar. The dark past had been made into a foundation rather than a weight. The secrets had been told, the betrayal that wasn't had been understood. The forced choice had been made in a saloon with a bluff and a steady voice, and it had led here. To this. To a morning in May with coffee and 2 children, and a man who said "I know you" with a simplicity that contained multitudes. Nelson came in eventually, lifting James, who was muddy and triumphant, and he looked at Harriet across the kitchen with the directness that was his nature and that she would never stop being grateful for. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. James announced something about the horse, urgently and at length, and Maggie banged on the tray of her chair in appreciation. And the coffee was ready, and the sun was coming through the kitchen window at an angle that was entirely specific to that kitchen in that valley at that time of year. And Harriet poured 2 cups and set them on the table and sat down, and Nelson sat across from her with the muddy boy in his lap, and the day began. The years that followed were full and changing and good in the way that real lives are good, not in a constant high register, but in the deeper key of days that accumulate into something that matters. The school became the best in the county, which Harriet would not have said herself but which was said about her, and she brought 2 more teachers over the following years, and eventually a proper school board that actually functioned as it should. Nelson's horse operation grew steadily, with a reputation that extended far enough that buyers came from distant places and brought money that meant improvements to the farm, a new barn, better paddock fencing, and eventually a small hired hand named Diego, the youngest of the Herrera family who had played at their wedding, who was 17 when Nelson hired him, and who turned out to be gifted with horses in a way that extended Nelson's capacity considerably. James Boone grew up tall and quiet like his father, with his mother's green eyes and something of both their stubbornness, which was considerable. He loved horses, naturally, and books, which pleased Harriet enormously, and he had a particular aptitude for mathematics that she was fairly sure did not come from her. Maggie grew up with opinions about everything and the absolute conviction that she was correct, which was occasionally exasperating, and which Harriet privately considered entirely appropriate. 2 more children came, in 1887 and 1889, another boy they named William and a girl they named Clara, after the first other teacher Harriet had worked with, who had by then gone back to Austin and married, but who remained a good correspondent. William was the loudest of the 4 from the very beginning, and showed every sign of remaining so. Clara was calm and watchful and observant in a way that made Harriet think, with a quality of feeling she could not entirely name, of a serious young woman arriving on an afternoon stage with a carpetbag and $40 and a determination to be enough. Nelson, at 41, with 4 children and a farm and a full life and a community that respected him, was different from the man in the alley on a Sunday morning, blood on his mouth and fury in his eyes. He was easier in himself, which was the simplest way she could put it. The dark past was still his, always would be, but it did not have the same weight anymore, partly because enough time had passed and partly because enough good had been built on top of it, and partly because Harriet had told him with a consistency and a clarity that he could not doubt, over the years they'd been together, that she saw all of it and found him, on the whole, more than sufficient. He told her, on an evening in the autumn of 1889, sitting on the porch with the children inside, and the valley going dark below the ridge, that he was grateful for her in a way he had no adequate language for. She knew that about him. That gratitude was a thing he felt deeply and expressed carefully, turning it over to make sure it was right before he offered it. "I know," she said, which was their word, their shorthand, the 2 words that had become their particular and private thing over the years, and he looked at her in the evening light with a warmth that had not diminished in the time she had known him. 7 years, he said. 7 years, she agreed. And I would do all of it again, including the bluff in the saloon. He laughed, which was not rare now, which was easy and warm and hers. "You terrified me," he said. "Not Dellard, you." "I know," she said again. He reached across and took her hand, the way he had taken it the first time in the draw by the cottonwoods, and held it, and the evening settled around them, and the creek ran below in the dark, and the town of Dusty Creek went about its business a few miles away, and the life they had built sat around them in the good, solid weight of a thing that has been made with care and time and honesty, and everything was resolved and at peace, and nothing was left open, and the creek kept running, clear and persistent, through the valley where they had chosen to stay. They had been chosen by each other first, and then by the place, and then by the life that grew from those 2 choices, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly what they were.